Good evening. I'm Sujata Gadkar-Wilcox, Assistant Professor of Legal Studies here at Quinnipiac University. This talk by Dr. Hugo Slim and the launching of Dr. Nabil Hamdi's new book, The Spacemaker's Guide to Big Change, are part of a Human Rights and Development Ethics seminar that includes students from the College of Arts and Sciences, the School of Business, the School of Law, the School of Communications, and the School of Nursing. I would like to thank these schools, as well as the Office of Academic Affairs, the Department of Cultural and Global Engagement, and the Albert Schweitzer Institute for their support. This seminar is also the result of a collaboration between the University of Oxford, the University of Oregon, the University of Southern California, the University of Arkansas, the University of Houston, and of course Quinnipiac University, and it includes students from those universities, among others. The need for this seminar is clear. Human rights, global ethics, and development have been at the center of contemporary political discourse for several decades. As universities and individuals committed to understanding the particularity of diverse experience, the varied approaches to international legal instruments, and the impact of community action and global politics, we must work together to build a foundation for recognizing the complexity of such issues when cultural, historical, and political contexts vary drastically throughout the international community. Accordingly, it's essential that we engage in a dialogue about these issues such as vulnerability, institutional conduct, collective action, and global responsibility in a rigorous, reflective, and scholarly seminar. The Human Rights and Development Ethics Seminar has been designed to build that foundation for students to pursue a career dedicated to issues of global justice, human rights, and development ethics. Hugo Slim's talk and Nabil Hamdi's book launch evidence the importance of balancing the conceptualization of human rights and development with the practical implementation of humanitarian action. Such action must address the specific needs of a community and speak in the voice of that community. To introduce our speakers tonight, it's my pleasure to welcome onto the stage someone who is himself a noted scholar of human rights, Dr. Paul Zaleza, our Vice President of Academic Affairs. And I'd like to thank Paul for supporting this important initiative, which has not only allowed us to bring these speakers here today, but has afforded our students the opportunity to partner with local organizations to do hands-on work addressing issues of vulnerability and fundamental rights in the context of community action. So please welcome Paul Zaleza.
First of all, welcome to our two guests, and good evening to everybody. Yeah, a little more excitement. This is a very important and very exciting seminar. I'd like to begin by thanking Sujata for organizing this very innovative seminar, which not only involves intra but inter-institutional collaborations. And it affords our students the opportunity to engage on a very important issue, issues of human rights and development, which of course should be of concern to all of us. And it provides our students an incredible opportunity for what we believe is an important part of their education, namely experiential learning, interdisciplinary learning, and of course, international education. For that, I would like to once again thank you, Sujata, for not only initiating the idea, but bringing it to fruition. So thank you. It is my pleasure to introduce Nabil Hamdi, who qualified as an architect at the Architectural Association in London in 1968. That has nothing to do with his age. He was very young. He worked for the Greater London Council between 1969 and 1978, where his award-winning housing projects established his reputation in participatory design and planning. From 1981 to 1990, he was Associate Professor of Housing at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he was later awarded a Ford International Career Development Professorship. In 1997, Nabil won the UN Habitat Scroll of Honor for his work on community action planning. He founded the master's course on development practice at Oxford Brookes University in 1992, which was awarded the Queen's Anniversary Prize for Higher and Further Education in 2001. He was awarded an honorary doctorate from the University of Pretoria, South Africa, in 2008. He is currently Professor Emeritus of Housing and Urban Development at Oxford Brookes University and Teaching Fellow at the Development Planning Unit, University College, London. He has been an Arab Fellow at the University of Cape Town and is Adjunct Professor at the National University of Technology in Norway. Nabil has consulted on participatory action planning and upgrading of slums in cities to all major international development agencies and to charities and NGOs worldwide. He's the author of Small Change, Housing Without Houses, co-author of Making Micro Plans and Action Planning for Cities, and editor of the collected volumes Educating for Real and Urban Features. Once again, Nabil, welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to talk to you for about 10 minutes to introduce you to the content of the book. And for many of you who will join us tomorrow, we will pursue some of that content in more detail. When I was asked by the publishers that I'd worked with for Small Change and the Placemaker's Guide for Building Community to update Small Change, I said to myself, well, it's time to reflect perhaps much more on what I've been doing in terms of my projects, what those books actually mean in terms of practice and so on. Hence, rather than update those books, I kind of decided to write a new book, which is a kind of an update. And on reflecting on what it takes to actually work in development in most of the settings that I worked in countries worldwide, I asked myself, you know, we call ourselves development practitioners. I don't know, what does it actually take to be a development practitioner? And in the end, I decided that actually development was about making space for things to happen, creating opportunities for people to discover their own opportunities. And that space can be created depending on your background politically, technically, spatially, whatever it might be, economically, and so on and so forth. I suppose the premise of the book, the core fundamental premise of the book, is that that space is most creatively cultivated at the interface between conventional positions. You know, in the old days I used to say, I'm a bottom-up architect, or somebody would say I'm a top-down architect, or I believe in the informal sector rather than the formal sector. I'm a believer in small organizations rather than large organizations. And I came to believe that actually most creative work was at the interface between those conventional positions. That's the space where often we discover new opportunities for relationships, new relationships between worlds, between different kinds of worlds, between partnerships, different kinds of organizations. And actually, it's the space in which we can begin to innovate with new kinds of organization. And I suppose that's what I mean in the book when I talk about practice as being a form of activism, and particularly participatory practice as being a form of activism. And that is that actually, in most of the work that we do, whether it's in the informal settlements worldwide or here or wherever it might be, it's about disturbing the status quo, it's about converging vested interests, inspiring positive change, trying to help build new futures for people who don't have that ability as such. These themes I explore in various ways in this book. In part one, learning practice, I argue the importance of building our understanding of place and deciding our actions according to 5 what I call progressively interrelated areas. Getting a sense of need and aspirations, problems and opportunities based on looking and listening, you know, our ways of seeing. Modifying our rationale for interventions based on ethical considerations. What are the ethical considerations for intervening in other people's organizations and place? Applying our disciplinary criteria in search of practical and often very sector-specific interventions. In other words, I'm an architect, I'm a houser, you know, how do I deal with the housing situation or the water and sanitation situation or whatever it might be? Expanding the value of that discipline through interdisciplinary work, which is where we begin to add larger relevance to our work, and then standing back from it all and adding what I call experiential value. Looking at, for example, at what we might be looking at and asking, for example, what would this place be like as a wonderful place to grow up in? What stories would we tell in that respect? And I end part one of the book by looking at themes that constantly recur in my kind of evaluation of places, you know, and they are themes that are either a measure of success or the failure of projects: ownership, organization, and asset accumulation. Asset accumulation in terms of both the tangible and intangible assets. And that's, of course, all about building livelihoods, about building our security insofar as the resilience to the stresses and the shocks and stresses of daily life. In part two, I focus very much on issues of making space for meaningful public engagement, where all the stakeholders can have an important part to play in impacting the decisions that we take on urban development. And I do this in three ways. First of all, I look at participation as an essential element of ensuring both equity and efficiency. And I remind everyone, as I think the historian Tony Judge once said, inequity is not just morally troublesome, it's also inefficient. And not only that, it's one of the most demeaning aspects of inequity is the erosion of optimism. One of the fundamental aspects of inequity is the erosion of, there's just no hope, there's no opportunity as such. Secondly, I look at participation in the context of city form, profiling some of the big issues we face today in cities and their impact on city life. And thirdly, what this means for practice, what it means in terms of the life and organization of place, what it means in terms of the nature and scope of practice, and importantly, what it means in terms of our own responsibilities as practitioners. And I have my PES profile, Ps, providing, enabling, adapting, and sustaining. Anytime we intervene in any one place, we invoke all four of those sets of responsibilities. How do they overlap, as it were? In part three, I focus very much on making political space, looking at ways of informing policy from practice. And usually it's the other way around. We make policies and out of policy comes practice. And I reverse that process. I look at what practice means insofar as it's invoking policy, what policy environments can be created out of our understanding of what's going on in practice. And I go back and look at projects that I've done and reflect on them, one in London, Pshak, one, the Million Houses program in Sri Lanka, and a whole bundle of projects that I actually looked at in the post-tsunami in both India and mostly in Sri Lanka. In each of the studies I visit, we look at ways in which we can begin to converge interests. Political ideals with practical realities, we look at how mindsets, habits, and behavior amongst the authorities have changed as a result of that understanding. And thirdly, what this means for new policy. In part four, which is the last part, again looking at the impact of these things, I look at enablement and the art of improvisation, which illustrates examples which it takes to negotiate incrementally through a series of improvised workshops, a plan of work, how to work with troublemakers, how to negotiate, how to actually reach agreement, not based on compromise, but based on dancing with conflict, which actually means accommodating interests rather than trying to neutralizing everything. And I tell a number of stories out of that. Just changing that. In the last part of part four, I reflect back on a chapter which Hugo, much as I hate to refer to his work, sorry Hugo, yeah, wrote in a book of mine. Is that very good? Yeah. Educating for Real, where we talk about, we consider the skills and competences needed to acquire prudence or practical wisdom, getting insiders out and outsiders in. What does it take actually to be a practitioner insofar as gaining that practical wisdom? And Hugo invokes a comment and a statement from Aristotle in which he talks about three things that are absolutely critical to gaining that practical wisdom. Deliberative excellence, the ability to weigh up, analyze, and deliberate toward the right decision with careful attention to context and context-specific considerations, understanding based as much on empathy as on scientific knowledge, and good judgment, judging correctly what is just and equitable based on ethical considerations, on disciplinary criteria, on interdisciplinary understanding of interrelationship between issues, and on the quality of those considerations when it comes to our relationships to people. All of which are fundamental to building resilience, they're fundamental to deciding how best to decide interventions, and fundamental to that open architecture of knowledge, that sort of knowledge commons that we talk about, sharing knowledge and so on. And I'd like to end with a little quote. And it actually is from Robert Kennedy. And he says, "The gross national product doesn't allow for the health of our children, the quality of our education, or the joy of their play. It doesn't introduce the beauty of our poetry, the intelligence of our public debate, or the integrity of our public officials. It measures neither our wit, nor our courage, neither our wisdom, nor our learning. It measures everything, in short, except that which makes life worthwhile." I'd like to think that that which makes life worthwhile is at the core of my ambitions, at least for this book. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nabil, for those words of wisdom, and I hope several of us are going to be able to buy the book and get the insights that he has shared with us very briefly. It's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Hugo Slim, Associate Director and Senior Research Fellow, Oxford Institute for Ethics, Law and Armed Conflict at Oxford University. Dr. Hugo Slim is a leading scholar in humanitarian studies with particular expertise in humanitarian ethics, the protection of civilians, conflict resolution, and business ethics. From 1983 to 1994, he worked as a frontline humanitarian worker for Save the Children UK and the United Nations in Morocco, Sudan and Ethiopia, the Palestinian territories, and Bangladesh. In 1994, he was appointed Reader in International Humanitarianism at Oxford Brookes University, where he co-founded an award-winning master's program for international humanitarian work. From 2003 to 2007, he was chief scholar at the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue in Geneva, leading policy work on civilian protection and political mediation. Hugo is an associate director and senior research fellow in the Department of Politics and International Relations. He is currently leading research on humanitarian ethics that will deliver the first major practical text on humanitarian ethics in war and disaster, and develop professional ethics in humanitarian organizations to new standards of care and accountability. He has also established the Oxford Humanitarian Group within ELAC, a new interdisciplinary discussion group for humanitarian studies that brings together the University of Oxford, Oxford Brookes University, and Oxfam. He's a frequent commentator on humanitarian action in print and on TV and radio, including BBC Radio 4 Today program and Mauro May's BBC World Service, Radio BBC Radio 3 Nightwaves articles in The Guardian. He has also done a lot of consultancy work with the world's leading humanitarian agencies, including UNWFP, the International Committee of the Red Cross, Australian Aid, and many leading NGOs. He has advised global business, including BP, Rio Tinto, G4S, and Vodafone on political risk, conflict resolution, and human rights in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. He has been on the board of Oxfam, Great Britain, and an international advisor to the British Red Cross, and is currently on the board of the Catholic Agency for Overseas Development and on the editorial board of the International Review of the Red Cross, which is published by Cambridge University Press. Among his publications, he has published more than 60 academic papers, and his most recent books include Essays in Humanitarian Action, published in 2012, Killing Civilians, Method, Madness, and Morality in War, published by Columbia in 2008, and Protection, a Guide for Humanitarian Agencies. Once again, welcome, Hugo, for visiting us. Thank you.
Vice President, thank you very much for such a warm welcome. And I must cut my CV. That's far too long. You had to really string it out there. I'm so sorry. First of all, let me thank you, Quinnipiac University. It's been such a pleasure to be here with you, and I must congratulate you on a really stunning week's workshop that you've designed. And the very generous support from all the various deans of the faculties and from the key players in the university. I don't know what the students think so far, but I think our first 3 days so far have been incredibly powerful and important. And I really hope that you can keep running this course and that we can keep doing it together. And Sujata, I also emphasize with great pleasure, great thanks for your dynamism. You've really made it happen, which is fantastic. But in NABS's theory of development, Quinnipiac has given you the space in which to make it happen, so that's great. And thanks to the students, too, as well, who are bringing so much energy and intelligence to this week, and it can only get better, I think, with NABS here now, which is great. I'm here to talk about something different to NABS, as I usually do, and I'm talking about a different field of the whole question of ethics, human rights in the world today. NABS is focusing on urban development, and you'll be looking at that tomorrow in New Haven. We've looked at human rights, and we've looked at big-time development with the UN up in New York and their Millennium Development Goals. I'm now going to focus on another area of global ethics, if you like, which is that age-old area of trying to help people who are suffering in the extreme situations of war and natural disaster. So I'm going to talk to you about the ethics of humanitarian action. What are the values and ethics of trying to help people in war? And so the context I'm talking about is emergency. It is a war like Syria. It is a natural disaster like the tsunami. It is a protracted crisis of a 10, 20-year civil war in a country like Somalia. It is South Sudan's current crisis. It's these sort of places. And when I talk about agencies, I'm talking largely about agencies like the Red Cross, like in America, the International Rescue Committee, IRC, or CARE, or World Vision, or in my own country, Oxfam, Save the Children, these kind of organizations. And of course, we must give the French their due, Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders. So I'm thinking of these kind of agencies as humanitarian agencies. And I want to try and do 4 things this evening in the next half hour or so. I want to think about global humanitarian action as a moral subject in global ethics. What do we feel about it? Is this a right thing to be doing or a wrong thing? Secondly, I want to then look at the practice of humanitarian action itself and look at the values, principles, and ethical ideals that the Red Cross and humanitarian agencies and the UN espouse and bring as their ideals to this business of helping people in war and disaster. Then I want to give just 4 little windows on particular kinds of moral problems that humanitarian agencies face and report. And then finally, I want to think, a bit like Nabs did at the end of his talk, what is the ethical humanitarian worker? What does it mean to be an ethical humanitarian worker? But first, we should probably define humanitarian action a little and humanitarian ethics. And when I was teaching with NABS for 10 years at Oxford Brookes, I was also raising very small children and quite busy and often not preparing my lectures as well as I should because I was up all night or I was getting up to make breakfast and things as one does. And I thought one rather desperate morning when I was making breakfast for my 2 little children, Jessie and Solly, And I had to give a lecture on what is humanitarian action and international humanitarianism. I thought, look, I really haven't prepared enough. I'll ask the children. So I said to them, and Jessie and Solly were sitting there, and Jessica must have been about 5, and Solly must have been about 3 or 4. And as I was making them their cereal and giving them their breakfast, I said, I'll just ask them what they think being humanitarian in war is. And they might help, So I said, Jessie, what do you think it is to be humanitarian in war? And she was eating her soup. She's a very thoughtful little girl. She's a big girl now. And she said, I think being humanitarian in war is being kind to people, especially women, children, and old people. And I thought, yeah, that's probably more or less what it is. That's very good, Jessie. That's about it. And then I could see my little son, Solly, also wanting to answer the question. So I said, and Solly, what do you think being humanitarian in war is? And he said, I think it's being kind to people in war and sharing your guns and bombs with your friends. And so there you have, in a sense, the problem of humanitarian action and aid and people's approaches to war. There's a gender issue, obviously. But it also reflects the different ways that governments might configure around the same conflict. Anyway, so that's what we're really talking about in terms of humanitarian action. But what are we talking about in the world today? What is this subject in global ethics? Well, it's grown enormously. When I started in 1983 as a humanitarian worker, aid budgets were very small. Nobody really took aid agencies seriously. Save the Children, which I joined, had an annual budget of 16 million pounds sterling, sort of, 22, 23 million dollars, okay? Now it's got a budget of 400 million sterling a year, and it's a huge transnational organization. And if we look at the scale of international emergency humanitarian aid, last year we're looking at an annual global budget of official aid, that is sort of transparent government aid and transparent giving by people like you and me to NGOs and aid agencies, of $17 billion last year. And that aid system, that humanitarian system, is reaching about 100 million people each year who are either trapped in a war like Syria or South Sudan, or who are dealing with an earthquake or a flood of various kinds. So we have to describe this now as a project, a global project, driven by global ethics of some kind. And in that $17 billion, your country, the United States, is the biggest and most generous single donor, giving usually about $9 billion a year. And I often think that Americans don't really understand the huge contribution they make and the leading role they play in humanitarian aid. But it is phenomenal. And actually, you are a very respected donor country. If you talk to a lot of agencies who deal with you, they like dealing with you. You have good people on the ground who know the problems and who are quick to give quite creative money quite often. So what we would say if we were looking at this project today is this extraordinary thing that today, in 2014, the chances are that anyone, anywhere in the world, who was facing a crisis of war or disaster would stand a chance of coming in contact with international humanitarian aid of some kind. Now, it's not always easy, as we know from watching the news about Syria, but it is extraordinary compared to 100 years ago, 50 years ago, that there is a nascent, emerging, global system of urgent, if you like, 911 kind of help in war and disaster. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, are we pleased about that? Are we glad about that? Is this something ethical? Is it right? Is it a good thing? Or is it a bad thing in our world to be beginning this huge system of humanitarian aid? And I think there's no doubt in my mind that it is a profoundly good thing, that the moral goal of this project, to help anyone, anywhere, in the best way possible, to endure and survive a war or disaster, is a morally good thing. It must be right. And it must also be right to do because we can do it. And if we think of Immanuel Kant's great dictum that ought implies can, we can only be imposed an obligation on ourselves if we can actually meet it. Well, we can meet this now. We know that actually we can set up a system that can protect and assist people. It fails very often, but it can do it. So we do have an obligation to do it, and it is the right thing to do. It is, in fact, even quite a wonderful thing in some ways that we can do this and reach out to anyone, anywhere, and try and get them help in some way. So the moral ends of this project to me are unambiguously good, and they are the right thing to pursue. I suppose where most of the criticism comes and where we might want to worry is about the means, the moral means of this project. Because here it is more tricky. We have a problem of mixed motives. Our governments give a lot of aid, but they tend probably to prioritize projects like Afghanistan, Iraq, or whatever, where they also have profound political objectives to achieve and where they can leverage aid into their wider objectives. So aid may be given and spread out around the world, but it may be unevenly spread and not always spread on need, but also spread on political intent. But we can also say about this project that when we're looking at the means of this project, how you do it, is it's genuinely very difficult. And often it fails. Because many people in a war, in particular, don't want aid going anywhere near their enemies, and they want to control aid very, very rigorously. So aid often fails, and if something's failing quite a lot, that also throws into question the morality of it to some degree. Perhaps more importantly about means is that we have to be frank if we look at this aid system today. We are looking at a post-colonial, potentially neo-colonial pattern to aid giving. There is certainly a colonial legacy in the agencies that give aid. They are mostly a rich world core of Occidental organizations like Oxfam, Médecins Sans Frontières, IRC, whatever. That's where most of the money and the power is. And they operate in many ways on an expeditionary model of going out from the West to these places, which is profoundly reminiscent of earlier models of mission and colonialism and imperialism of some kind. And often the way they are experienced by local communities in fleets of white Toyotas with a sort of elite of expatriates along the top of this system, living in much better houses than most people and things, is a profoundly colonial image to it. So there are issues with where the profession is at this time. So it could be said that this is a good thing being done in a bad way. I don't think it's quite that extreme, but I think that the profession is in a difficult intermediate phase where it needs to transition through that previous model into a much more empowering model of local models of effective humanitarian capacity, which can, in a sense, decolonize the current model. It's very interesting, and back in 1967, when Pope Paul VI was writing a very cutting-edge encyclical on which he called The Progress of Peoples, about development, he was very conscious of this, and he used this important phrase about aid workers, and he said, "Aid specialists must not act as overlords, but as helpers and fellow workers." And that is the challenge, particularly for the international elites in the current system. So to conclude on the first question, is this new project in global ethics a good one? I think it's an extremely good one. I think it's an incredibly important one. And I think we need to be mindful of the means, and many people are, and can continue to work on getting the best ways of doing this. If we now move to the ethics of humanitarian practice, how have humanitarian workers conceived of this project ethically? How have they decided that the best way ethically to operate in a very conflicted war when there are two sides fighting? How can you get into the middle of that war and argue for the protection of civilians, refugees, child soldiers, whatever? How can you bring humanitarian norms into a very conflicted situation? And we have to remember here that the tradition of what I'm speaking, the humanitarian action field, does actually spring from a slightly different route from the development field that NABS is engaged with. Because our field emerges from the route of rescue. It doesn't really emerge from the route of transformative social justice, some kind of political vision for a better society. It emerges from an ethical route of rescue. And it's about protecting and assisting people in crisis. It's not really about transforming societies to create justice and reduce inequality. So it's a strange interim ethic for crisis. And it has a long, long tradition. The Red Cross started in the 1863, really formalizing from there. Didn't do much, helped wounded people at that time. World War I was a huge moment of expansion. We're remembering that now in Britain a lot because it's 1914, 2014. World War I was really where modern humanitarianism expanded. And the guys that led that expansion were the Americans, of course, because we often forget this, but you were neutral in First World War until 1917. So for the first 3 years of the war, you were the big humanitarian power. Not only did you bring masses of resources and food to Europe and led the massive relief operation into Belgium and all sorts of other places, but Americans were truly neutral. They could walk through any part of Europe and negotiate with all parties because they were neutral until they joined the war. So a lot of humanitarian expansion happened in World War I under Americans, particularly Hoover, who became president later and you all loathe for the recession. But actually, he was a phenomenal humanitarian hero. He was quite extraordinary, and a Quaker, as you know. After World War I, we had World War II, and in that process, the humanitarian agenda went from wounded soldiers to prisoners, visiting prisoners of war, caring for prisoners, and to the civilian population in general. And that's where it really took off. And after the World War II, we had this, in a way, expansion out into former colonies and the whole notion of working in decolonizing wars, African wars, Asian wars, Latin American wars, and of course Middle East wars. Now, what principles did humanitarians come up with in order to try and justify and make effective their project? In 1967, a great Genevan lawyer working for the International Red Cross formulated 7 principles of humanitarian action for the Red Cross and began to conceptualize humanitarian work as a principles-based movement. And the core 4 that he founded are humanity, impartiality, neutrality, and independence. And I'll just whiz through those because they're important to understand. So if you scratch a humanitarian, they should say, I'm about humanity, impartiality, neutrality, and independence. That's what I'm here to do. Okay, that's what they should be saying. And humanity is the main goal of their project. And this says that their project is to save and protect human life. So the humanitarian would say, whether he's with the Red Cross or she's with Médecins Sans Frontières or whatever, that every human life is precious. And their object in any situation is simply the human person. They have no political agenda around transforming society or whatever. Their teleology in ethics, their goal is purely the human person. They have a teleology of person, not politics. And that is how they understand their mission. So it is purely about, if you like, in religious language, the sanctity of life, the preciousness of each person, and that each person must be protected in a crisis. Now, they move on to say that they work on a principle of impartiality, by which they mean that they see a radical equality of people. So they do not see people, they do not discriminate people in a conflict or in a disaster on the basis of religion, color, gender, class, political opinion, whatever. They see only the person. And the way they begin to answer ethical questions, distributive questions of how will they offer resources, is not on identity, but on need. So the principle of impartiality states that humanitarian aid and action will only ever be given on the basis of need alone. Okay. So they would argue that they seek to be politically blind to people in a conflict or a disaster and see only need and respond to that need in proportion to who needs what. So those are the goals, really, of their project, a radical equality to protect the human person. But they're operating in a very political space. So they also adopt two political principles, and those are neutrality and independence. So they would argue that in order to build the trust and confidence of the warring parties, they are neutral. And by that they mean they adopt a position of reserve from the conflict. So that means material reserve and opinion reserve. So they will not use their materials or resources in any way that creates unfair advantage in that conflict to either side. Okay? And they will also stay out of the ideological conversation around that conflict, and they will reserve their opinion on who's right, who's wrong, whatever. And that is their commitment to be neutral. And of course that would be very different to a social justice activist in development work who would say they were anything but neutral. They were probably taking the side of the poor and working for social justice. And when you talk to humanitarians, they're saying very, very practically, we're not saying that neutrality is a wonderful moral value that we should all do. On the contrary, none of us would be neutral in our lives. But it is a role morality in order to create trust, in order to get where we need to be and deal with people we need to negotiate with to get access, we will be neutral. Okay. And the second one, which is very similar, is independence. So the other thing they will say is they seek independence. They do not want to have undue influence from people that are paying, governments that are giving them money, like the American government or the British government, or the government in that war, whether it's the South Sudanese government or a rebel group or whatever. They want to be independent and have autonomy. So they argue for independence. So those core four, humanity, impartiality is the vision and the goal and the purpose. Neutrality and independence is the political principles that lets them swim like a fish, theoretically, through a very difficult conflict. In 1991, people developed more principles and said there also needs to be proper ways of working with people. So in a sense, they introduced a code of conduct, which included those four, but then added another 6, which are really much more in the nature of development work, because they're about trying to work with people in a way that is dignified for people. So they adopted participation and inclusion and consultation as a core principle in humanitarian work. So you don't just arrive and be bossy in your white Toyota and tell people what they need because you've got it in the back of the truck, so you assume that's what they need and so you give it to them. You actually work with them in a participatory way as much as possible, which is often very difficult in a war when speaking out about anything can cost your life. And you try and include people in the decisions about their needs and their aid. They also worked on an idea of empowerment, that if you're working with people, you should seek to empower them so they can actually work for their own survival, their own recovery. And, very, very importantly, they introduced the principle of respect, because one of the big criticisms, and you may have it yourself about humanitarian agencies, is that they sell suffering, and they excel actually really undignified, inhumane images of people, which they decided they must no longer do, but many still do. So there was a commitment to represent victims with dignity. And this phrase, disaster pornography, was a very powerful one at that time, which people sought to end, and they haven't quite, but they should. The classic example of that is that you'll often see a picture on an NGO poster of maybe an African mother with a very starving child. And the agency will give the impression that they are solving that problem. And this woman and the child are victims. And often you won't really get the face, you'll just get these grim body pictures. Now, of course, that's a complete deceit, because as anyone who's worked in an emergency will know, the chances are that that mother has probably just walked for 6 weeks with probably 3 children. She may have lost one on the way to starvation. She will have endured extraordinary hardship and had amazing courage to get to a place where at last there is an agency of some kind. So it's a complete misrepresentation of the fact. And that's why it's so important that we encourage agencies to respect the truth about the people they're talking about. So those additional principles of participation, empowerment, inclusion, and respect are embodied in humanitarian ethics. So if that's the way they conceive of their business ethically, let me just give you, and there are many moral problems in humanitarian work, but let me just give you a window into 4 problems, because of course that is the ideals. That is what it would be like. In a perfect world, we could all just focus on humanity and impartiality, be neutral and independent, and give people a dignified process of humanitarian aid. But then there's the world. And I'll just give 4 examples of typical problems that agencies face. And the first one is problems of potential complicity with the war aims of various warring parties in a war. Very soon, when a humanitarian agency arrives in a war, it is pretty quickly overpowered by political power, because people can tell it where to go, they can stop it from going to other places, they can confiscate its aid, they can put real pressure on it to do what they want it to do in their war. So being independent, being neutral is really hard, in fact. Let me give you the example of Darfur, because very often agencies feel that they are becoming complicit in inhumane strategies of warring parties. So when you have a situation of extreme violence and ethnic cleansing and the deliberate dispersal of villages in Darfur, as we did in Sudan at that time, people will walk out in search of, they're fleeing their villages, and they'll sort of walk away and try and flee, and inevitably they will gather in places, and then agencies will set up what they call internally displaced people's camps, and they will start providing water, food, try and create a safe area and protect. And very soon you are building up these, which are effectively almost peri-urban, semi-urban settings, which might have 15, 20, 30, and then 100,000 people in them over time. And of course, at one level that looks fantastic because you're saving these people's lives, because they would have died, and they would have done. But at the other level it looks, you're absolutely doing exactly what the Khartoum government wants to do, to clear that area and actually to reconfigure this population into a semi-urbanized population under very direct control and totally reconstruct the demography and landscape of Darfur and the politics of Darfur. So agencies will get into a real moral angst. Are we just implementing a vicious counterinsurgency strategy? Are we the sort of soft power to Sudanese and Janjaweed hard power? And I've just spent the last month in Myanmar, Burma, as it used to be called, for the UN, looking at a similar problem in Rakhine State, which is the state that borders Bangladesh. So it's where Buddhist culture and Muslim culture meet and rub, and have done for hundreds of years now. And the Muslim minority there is under intense persecution. And there's been a long pattern of gradually the erosion of their rights, constant questioning of their citizenship, the idea that they're immigrants, illegal immigrants. A lot of Buddhist Burmese fear that they're going to be overrun by Islam, and they have to hold this line and push these people out and really limit the number of Muslims in their state. And there's been horrible patterns of pogroms there, and in 2012 it reached quite a peak when these things are always trumped up with some spark trigger. But Buddhist groups attacked Muslim villages, and then Muslim villages fought back a bit. And we saw massive house burning, massive lynching and murder, about 250 people murdered, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of houses burnt and destroyed, and people fled. And a lot of them fled into displaced people's camps. And then other Muslim villages, the government took the opportunity to declare a state of emergency and say Muslims cannot move outside their villages or IDP camps now. So they then became restricted villages with no freedom of movement. All their livelihoods were gone. A lot of their businesses were burnt anyway. And in IDP camps, they couldn't move either. Now, the same thing happened. Aid agencies, of course, moved in as fast as they could to support the government in building new shelters, in getting food, in getting emergency medical systems up, and beginning to support that dispossessed community. The challenge they face now is that the government is now pretty determined to keep that as it is and not let things return to normal. They want to use this frozen situation to do a citizenship verification program where they will decide with each person whether they're a real Myanmar Muslim or not. And if they are, they won't go back to where they used to live. They'll be relocated into Muslim villages, Muslim areas, and those who are deemed illegal will be transferred out of the state somehow. And I don't know how this is going to happen, and it won't happen quickly. But the aid agencies find themselves in the same situation, where they're actually creating a lot of these spaces, needing to make better clinics, better shelters, because they're so bad and the living conditions are so bad. But are they therefore cooperating and colluding in a system that is permanently creating new segregated, persecuted space? It's a very difficult challenge. So those questions of complicity are very deep in many humanitarian operations. And all I would say, and I think it's an important thing, just to make two ethical points. And the first ethical point is a fundamental point that is true in all areas of our lives, or many of them, that identical actions can be ethically different. So let me give you a little example. You may be in a car park outside a shopping mall, as you call them here, and you might see a woman, quite an old woman, coming out holding her bags, and you might see a young man reaching into her handbag and taking out the car keys. Okay? Now, you could see that situation. In one situation, what would you be seeing? You'd be seeing that action, and actually what was happening is an old woman was walking to her car, she couldn't reach, and she asked a nice young man, could you just take my car keys out of my bag for me? Thanks a lot, then open the car. That's one thing. But you could also be seeing that, and you could be seeing an old woman walking to the car, struggling with her shopping, her handbag's on the back, she's got no arm movement, and a young man taking her car keys and nicking them, stealing them. Okay? So those are identical actions, but the intent is dramatically different. The context is dramatically different, but it's exactly the same action. And I think when we look at agencies working in IDP camps, we have to recognize that their intentions, their ethical intentions, are radically different from the Khartoum government's ethnic cleansing intention, and radically different from the Myanmar's government's determination to persecute and segregate the Muslim community. So in terms of complicity, we cannot say they are complicit, because to be complicit, you have to share an intention and share the same moral stance with someone, and agencies do not. But we could be forced to argue with them about an unfair, that they are making a significant contribution that they should be mindful of because it enables other people. But then again, we'd have to show that their actions are essential to government projects. They're not always essential. The government would probably do them anyway, and how central they are, and those sort of judgments. So what often looks and feels like complicity, because it feels very uncomfortable to aid workers, in my view, is genuinely not very often. The second thing that's very important and agencies worry about a lot is their silence. Whether they should speak out more, or whether it's ever legitimate to be silenced. And very often humanitarian agencies are very close to human rights violations. They hear about women being raped in camps, or they hear about a male massacre somewhere, or they hear about the recruitment of child soldiers, or they see it. Now, should they speak out about that and be very vocal about it? And this concerns them a lot too. And very often they don't. And is their silence in some way some kind of a complicity? And again, it's never that simple. One of the problems humanitarian agencies face today is that there is a sort of macho culture in human rights work, that you're not really a human rights worker unless you're constantly speaking truth to power and being really in the face of violating regimes and things. And there's a lot to be said for that, for human rights agencies. But is it always wise for humanitarian agencies to speak out and not just truth tell, but truth yell, like many human rights agencies do? And I think we have to say it's not. Sometimes it's not wise, sometimes it's not right, because what can happen very easily is if you do speak out, you can put the lives of people who have been talking to you at risk. You can put your own staff workers' lives at risk. So there are often real life and death issues that make it unwise to speak out. But more importantly, it's not always necessary for you to speak out as a humanitarian agency, because there are lots of other people speaking out. So you can pass information quietly, or you can know that other people have that information. So you don't have to speak out either. And the other thing is that sometimes speaking out just makes no difference at all. It may satisfy you. You feel that you've spoken truth to power as a human rights worker or a humanitarian worker, but you can be sure that it actually won't make any difference in that situation. So sometimes the truth is that humanitarian silence, in my view, is legitimate. under those kind of conditions. And humanitarians always, they shouldn't feel the pressure and they shouldn't be accused of not speaking out. Sometimes a failure to speak out will be a true moral failure. But many times humanitarian silence, it may look odd, but it can be legitimate. And very often it can be quite eloquent in a bizarre way, because an agency that is so close and yet is not speaking out and is silent can be silent in such a way that in a way their silence can be damning in itself, because people know that they know. So that's another issue that's not as simple as it sounds sometimes, but it concerns aid workers a lot, whether they should be quiet or whether it's immoral to be quiet. The third issue is boundary problems with NABS's project of development, because humanitarian agencies often face this question of how far can we go in working with a community? In a way, when do we stop just being concerned about individual people's lives? And then when do we start entering into that socially transformative, activist, in a way politically driven form of activism? So there are boundary problems they worry about. And again, I don't think this is necessarily complicated. If you're a humanitarian agency, you're not expected at that moment in crisis to be changing the world and building a new society. You are rightly protecting people's lives. But I think there are some principles there that should be used to guide people, because you should never do humanitarian work in such a way that you undermine the potential and the possibility of more progressive work like that. Therefore, you shouldn't undermine local structures. You shouldn't create patterns of giving and aid which then make it impossible to work in a consultative, participatory way later. So there's a precautionary principle in humanitarian work that you should always take precautions not to damage any possibilities for later development work. But it's more complicated than that, because in most crises, if you look at the Syria crisis now, that will probably last for between 10 and 20 years. And South Sudan, I mean, agencies have been in South Sudan now since the 50s and the 60s, certainly the 70s and the 80s. So when you are alongside people for long periods, your moral relationship with them inevitably thickens. And it becomes impossible to say to people, you won't help them with certain things because your mandate is only humanitarian. That doesn't work anymore. Obligations change. So in protracted emergencies, it does make sense to creep more towards a development agenda as well. If you're going to be with people for 5, 10, 15 years, you can't just be a minimalist alongside them. And particularly if no one else is there, that kind of humanitarian minimalism would actually be morally negligent, to fail to do something that you can do and that needs to be done, I think. The fourth thing, and then I'll wind up a little, is the risk of victimization. It comes back to that earlier point I made about respect for the person who is suffering. Huge damage can be done by ideologies of pity and paternalism. In a profession which is so concerned always to be focusing on suffering and victims and calling attention to it, it's very easy and very dangerous to see people as nothing but victims, and to start talking about them with labels like IDPs, refugees, beneficiaries, people who are raped. You just see them in terms of their victimhood all the time. And this is a very damaging and dangerous way to begin to gaze upon people. And it is, I think, a strategic moral risk in humanitarian work. Humanitarian workers have to remember that the people before them are agents of their own survival, actors in their own lives to protect their children, to think of a future, to make things happen, to overcome what they've been through. And those people in front of them are often incredible manifestations of human life lived with dignity. So that moral risk is a constant one, and it's a pernicious one. And I think you, as citizens, should always challenge humanitarian agencies to really see people for who they are and not just as victims. So to conclude, what would the humanitarian worker look like? What would a truly ethical humanitarian worker look like in such a difficult context as the ones we've talked about? What is a good humanitarian worker? And the first thing to point out here is that 96% of the world's humanitarian workers are African, Asian, Middle Eastern, Latin American people. So we're often given an impression by the sort of fairy tale narrative of emergency work that it's all these Europeans and Americans that are doing stuff and are somehow heroic. They're not, really. The real bulk of humanitarian workers are people from within the war-torn society or from within the natural disaster society. So what sort of ethics do those people need, do most humanitarian workers need? And I think we can talk about humanitarian virtues. I think it's very clear that to be a good humanitarian worker, in the same way that to be a good community development worker, you have to be close to the people you're concerned with. And you have to have empathy and imagination for what they've been through, for what they're going through, for what their options are. You have to, in the words of Simone Weil, the French philosopher, you have to have a real attention to the people before you. So there's a real commitment, as we've heard from NABS's community, to have and pay attention to people in this situation. And that really is the sort of intimate ethics of humanitarian work, the intimate virtues of being able to really listen and understand and design with, in the same way that NABS's community does, to design with people in crisis, ways for them to survive and move on from that crisis. The second one, though, is this more technical aspect of moral expertise. Again, the idea that Nabil mentioned of deliberation. So a good humanitarian worker has to be able to sit with people who are suffering from a conflict and sit with people who are driving that conflict, the warring parties, and sit with people who are going to pay for humanitarian aid, and work out and deliberate and calculate and think what is best to do with the resources at hand. What is the best way to distribute them? What is the best way to prioritize particular programs? What is the best models of delivering aid? Is it cash, food? Is it an intense medical operation, or is it other things? And that kind of deliberative excellence is key to humanitarian work. But I think fundamentally as well, there needs to be, and I'm also echoing Nabil's vision of the community development worker, there has to be a sort of humanitarian wisdom, because all humanitarian workers are always navigating difficult, hard political compromises, because in most wars, as I said at the beginning, people are out to dominate their resources, to restrict their movement, to make aid play well in their war for them. So to be a good humanitarian worker means navigating those non-ideal settings, and it means bringing the humanitarian principles into the hard life of politics. So it means being wise enough so that you are impartial enough as an agency, so that you are neutral enough, so that you are participatory enough in a very restrained way, so that you bring as much of those principles into play as you can. And very often, usually, you will not get anywhere near 100% of those principles. You won't be able to be totally impartial, totally neutral, and only operate on humanity. So that's the challenge, I think, some kind of humanitarian virtues of an intimate connection with people, moral expertise about making good, deliberative, operational judgments about distributing resources and working things out, and a humanitarian wisdom, a political wisdom about how you can operate amidst the politics. And then you can be as effective as possible. So I'll leave it there and hope that that's given you some sort of introduction to humanitarian ethics, the global challenge of this profession today as it grows, the post-colonial legacy that still taints the profession and which must be transformed over the next 5 to 10 years, and some of the moral challenges and the moral wisdom required. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And 4 things that you said actually that we think about too at the university: empathy, imagination, attention, commitment. These are things that we're working on too, and hopefully our students will be will continue to engage with these issues on campus, with local organizations, and to continue to think about them throughout their time here and as they go on to their professions. So maybe we can, we have some time for questions. There is, I'm not sure if we need to use microphones. If anybody has questions, just raise your hand. And, yeah.
Thank you very much for a very fascinating and thought-provoking talk. You touched on several key issues on development, global ethics of development. Earlier in the remarks, you did mention the $17 or so billion global aid industry, and you kind of talked about how America contributes about $9 billion or so that amount. What would you say to those who are critical of America's contribution to the global aid industry, who say, relative to America's GDP, America actually gives quite less in terms of its GDP compared to countries such as Norway or Sweden, who give far more as a percentage of their GDP. And also, I'm pretty sure you're familiar with Dambisa Moyo's book, Their Aid. What would you say to skeptics who say, okay, for example, let me give you a scenario. My students are sometimes shocked when I remark or tell them in class that I don't believe in aid, and if anyone wants to give aid to, for example, I'm originally from Sierra Leone, and I would say, don't give any aid or money to Sierra Leone. They're quite shocked as to why I say that. So what would you say to those who say that aid is dead, aid does not work, that basically aid is overhyped, given it's fungible, and any number of reasons, really, that could go on and on about. We're talking in the context of an Ebola epidemic, to speak. There are lots of actions on the ground, some good, some bad. We touched on some of those issues. But speak particularly to the fungibility of aid. How can you, for example, distinguish between what America or Norway is giving on the ground, when you're on the ground and in the middle of all kinds of activities that are going on? Some people think or tend to believe that aid is one big holiday for aid workers. They go in there and they're really just on vacation. And aid has been going on for 20 years plus, 30 years plus, and nothing has changed. So what would you really say to skeptics? Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Should we take them one at a time? Yeah. Yeah. Thanks very much. On the percentage of GDP, I mean, I would tend to agree. I mean, in Britain, we've fought really hard, and actually all governments have fought to try and reach this 0.7% of GDP target that the UN has set for countries to give aid at 0.7% of their GDP. And obviously, America's not close to that. I think you're about 0.3 or 4. So I have no doubt in volume terms you could give much more. Okay. I have no doubt about that, and maybe you should, and it all depends on what you prioritize, obviously. But of course, ethically, the answer to your next question is the key one, because if there's no point giving aid, then there's no point giving more of it, okay? If you think it's dead and it doesn't work. So in answer to that, my view is that a lot of aid has been incredibly important, actually, and I think a lot of aid that's been invested carefully in health and education, particularly, has been, and you can show from the statistics of maternal mortality and infant mortality and stuff that it has an impact in primary school enrollment. So there are ways you can see that it's making an impact. And there's no doubt that if you did stop quite a lot of aid in certain countries, then you would have school closures, clinic closures, hospital closures, etc. So in a welfare position, I think aid has made a significant contribution. Where I would agree with Dambisa Moyo a bit, I'm not really into sort of trashing aid like she wants to, and I think you can trash it in terms of elites. I would tend to agree with you that in corrupt governments, then aid the fungibility problem is a real issue because it can be captured, stolen, reorientated, whatever. But if it's properly channeled into social services, I think it works well. But to pretend that aid is the answer to poverty is ridiculous. And this is where Moyo is right, because in fact, if you can get business investment, if you can drive foreign direct investment, the volumes of capital coming from commercial foreign direct investment dwarf, aid budgets. you've got private equity companies, hedge fund companies that have got, $70 billion to invest in Africa alone. They're all over London, New York, Boston, wherever they are. It's, dwarfs aid budgets. So, in a way, if you were to look at where the critical money is for development, it actually sits potentially with business investment. And therefore, the challenge is for us as citizens to make very strong demands on the way business invests and on governments like Sierra Leone and others to be transparent about business investments. So in many ways, I think we've got to get beyond this simplistic idea that, from the 60s and 70s and 80s, that it's aid that's going to create development and reduce poverty. It's not. That plays a small part, usually quite a marginal part, around social services and welfare provision and creating good governance, political contract, maybe civil society space. But economies and, in ways, change are going to be driven by FDI. So I think that's more significant.
I'd like to explore, or have you explore a bit, the issue of neutrality. So let's take Gaza. And it would seem rather straightforward that to rebuild, they need cement. And yet, if you're familiar with the conflict, as I assume most people here, the Israeli government prohibits the importation of cement because it is presumably used to build tunnels. And under the current restrictions, it will probably take, some estimates are, up to 20 years to get back to where they were before the start of the most recent conflict. Is it possible, if you are invested in humanitarian aid, say, to support the situation, the current state in Gaza, to be neutral about this issue? And I'll give maybe one other. Since you mentioned Syria, of course, we are well aware of ISIS, and that some say that they stand, they're even considered by Al-Qaeda to be out of bounds. And yet, are they outside the circle of humanity, be it the Islamist notion, or recently Westmore, who wrote a book called The Other Westmore, which is being read here, made a comment that to the effect that even some of the worst people do not stand outside the circle of humanity. So, is there a time when we cannot remain neutral? When a group, an entity is so far outside the boundaries of any appeal to notions of human rights, however you situate them personally, and how they may be enshrined in international law. So if you don't mind walking through maybe about Gaza and what to do about the caliphate.
Thank you. I might not walk through, I might stumble through if that's all right, but I'll do my best. So, from the humanitarian point of view, in Gaza and cement is a great example. You're right to point out the tunnel issue, because what the Israelis will be arguing is that under the Fourth Geneva Convention, Article 23, it makes it quite clear that aid consignments must be given free passage, humanitarian consignments must be given free passage, unless there is strong evidence that they will be used to create unfair advantage, military advantage in the conflict, in which case a power can, withhold humanitarian stuff or block it or block agencies. So, that is what the Israelis will be arguing, and that's the sort of nub of the problem. And therefore, it's up to humanitarian agencies to argue back very strongly and somehow find a way to show that the cement they're going to use is going to be used for reconstruction, etc., etc., etc. But that's a classic example of the kind of very bitter problems you get with aid, and obstruction is totally the norm in most wars. Obstruction or just theft of aid resources in other checkpoints and things. So it's a struggle. And I mean, I don't think it's not difficult for, as I said earlier, none of us are neutral about these conflicts. We all take a side, we all have a view. And probably most of us would agree in most conflicts about, who's the best and worst party or whatever. But in terms of being a humanitarian agency, that's the argument you'd have to have with the Israelis. And you'd have to have it with the Palestinian side as well. You'd have to go to Hamas and say, look, if we bring in this cement, this is what we're going to do with it. And you'd have to get guarantees from both sides. It's slow, it's painstaking, it often doesn't work. So, I mean, that's what I meant earlier about the nature of conflict is such that often this project fails. And it's not easy. On the ISIL stuff, again, from the humanitarian, we would all have a clear view morally of this group, as we would have done in Sierra Leone of the RUF or people of the kind of things they were doing. We would have strong views about that. But for humanitarians, they will have to deal with ISIL. They've dealt with them before in Syria anyway, because if they want to get medicine into ISIL-held areas eventually, if they want to visit people detained by ISIL in prisons or whatever, they're going to have to deal with them. And most humanitarians would always try and deal with all warring parties. It's become problematic in the last 10 years because of American and European legislation about dealing with terrorists. So actually it's really hard to deal with a lot of these groups now. But you can be sure that a group like the International Committee of the Red Cross will be in touch with them, will be negotiating, will be trying to find ways to reach people detained and get aid in. And you have to judge, I suppose, whether you think that's an immoral project to deal with people like that. I would tend to think that if you've got the chance of getting food or water or improved systems into areas controlled by ISIS, then you should try. That's what I would say. I think it'll be very difficult. And in fact, in many parts of opposition-held Syria, NGOs found that it was actually quite interesting. It was easier to deal with the Islamists because they, as we know, had such an often appallingly tight grip over a space or a territory they were controlling that they really could distribute aid in an incredibly organized fashion, and you could see what they were doing. But it's very hard. But the humanitarian principle would be to deal with all parties, simply as that. In the cause of humanity, to protect and save lives in areas held by those parties.
Hi, Dr. Slim. There's a group that the UN doesn't formally recognize. Sometimes they're called gatekeepers, but they're basically private businesses that have popped up around skimming refugee camp aid. Do you think that supporting something like that, as opposed to a government or a terrorist group, something like that, which would not exist if the aid weren't there, whereas the oppressive government would? The gatekeepers who skim aid in order to maintain sort of private refugee camps, do you think that that is moral? Because if you stopped aid, they would disappear, right? And if you do think it's moral, do you think there's a percentage at which it's not? 80% skimming, 90%, 99%?
I haven't heard this phrase. So these are people that control the camp and actually take a tax, basically take it for themselves.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Which is, yeah. So, and that is a classic, it's a good example of a classic humanitarian problem because it happens almost everywhere. Skimming of some kind. I mean, my view is it's just a difficult moral problem, but my view would usually be that you have to stay for the greater good of the population that's getting something, and that in staying and making that decision, you have to work hard on mitigating the risk of skimming as much as possible, challenging it. But again, I don't think that's an issue of agency complicity, and I don't think it's an agency taking such a central role in a problem that they're creating an even greater evil. I don't think they are. And I think it's very important to focus responsibility on where the responsibility is. I mean, the people that have responsibility for that are the skimmers, okay, not the agencies. They should be in the spotlight. And there are other authorities around that should be trying to leverage the skimmers to stop it happening. But in most cases, I would tend to think that pulling out is going to be much more morally problematic, actually, than tolerating a bit of skimming and trying to mitigate it as much as possible. But it's a good example of these very hard judgments agencies have to. They're real-world judgments. They're, Nabs used the word accommodation earlier, but it's difficult for aid agencies to say they're accommodating skimmers and armed groups and difficult government policies, but often they usually are in some way.
Thank you. I think there was great hope at one point that the television was going to bring people together because we were going to be able to see into the lives of other human beings. I'm wondering, you mentioned the photograph from manipulation that's represented there. I'm wondering what your opinion is in terms of the internet and media. Is it creating a sense of emotional distance? Are we seeing, in a sense, what are we seeing?
Well, I think it's like all technology. It's like a pen. I can use it to write the greatest poem that's ever been written, or I can, stab someone in the eye with it. All technology is profoundly ambiguous. And it's the same with this stuff, because, what's happening at the moment is, you are getting a lot of dense visual representation of these crises, but they tend to end up in particular kinds of iconic tableau, as I was saying earlier. So they become these iconic images, and people, well, you guys from literary studies and things understand this better than me, but they take on a particular image which can be very damaging, I think, in some ways. And they're often self-serving for the agency or the journalist much more than they're serving for the person involved. But the other thing that is happening is that a lot of new technology has allowed a lot of voices to come out of the war as it's happening. So you get a lot of people, these new media journalists, so a lot of the coverage coming out of Syria and other wars has been by amateur guys Skyping news and that sort of thing. So that's quite interesting. Again, they'll be positioned. They may not be impartial. They're not journalists necessarily as we would understand it, but it has created a voice from within the war. And it means that the war is not always being mediated by agencies or whatever. The other thing that's happened is that and aid agencies are trying to use this a lot to actually adopt methods of crowdsourcing, because a lot of people are now saying, they're tweeting or they're Skyping or emailing, we need this here, this area's just been bombed, that hospital's gone now, this has run out of this, that, and the other. And a lot of this stuff streaming around on the net. So big UN and Red Cross agencies are interested to see if they can use crowdsourcing models of needs assessment, basically, which might give them extraordinary, grounded, granular details if they can rely on them. But if it's actually, the Syrian government's propaganda machine that's tweeting, this hospital's been bombed or something by the opposition when it hasn't or whatever, then it's problematic. So it's a question of how you verify this massive new amount of information that's coming up from the war. But it's definitely changing.
Ashley, let's see.
In your article on fidelity and variation, you mentioned how humanitarian aid organizations need to worry about being driven away by commercial and military competitors because they might not have the same ideas and morals. How would they do that?
So that's the issue that actually, another thing that's happened in the last 10, 20 years is a lot of military have provided humanitarian aid, and a lot of commercial companies are being subcontracted by USAID, your government, or my government, DFID, to provide elements of aid or convoys or trucks, or actually commercial companies are being asked to sort of do the water for one region or whatever. So that's happened a lot. I mean, I wrote that years ago, in 2001, I think. So that's happened a lot now. And in a sense, I don't have a problem with who does it. It's a question of what incentives drive them to do it and mixed motives they may have, and whether they can do it in line with humanitarian principles, whether they can focus on it impartially, whether they can do it independently and neutrally. So it's just like the same discussion in our prisons in UK, where we've privatized quite a lot of them, so we've got commercial companies running prisons. Well, are we just going to be ideological about the fact that that's not on, or are we going to look at how they perform and if they create good prisons or whatever. So my own view is that I'm not fussy about who becomes a humanitarian actor, but I am fussy about how they operate, if that makes sense.
I have two questions. The first one is, based on your experience, over past, let's say, 20, 30, or 40 years, humanitarian effort has been increased. But compared to the increased frequency in natural disaster because of global warming and the increased frequency of scope of conflict, I mean human-caused war, what do you think the increased humanitarian have been catching up of this increased disaster and war conflict?
Well, that's right. I mean, the disasters are getting more frequent and bigger when they happen, and they're partly bigger, and this is what actually is mentioned in Nabs's book as well, because urbanization is so intense now that if you've got these huge areas of vulnerable urban housing and stuff in quite small areas, which if they're hit, then the devastation is much bigger potentially. So the vulnerability of human communities is often much more intense and bigger now. So have aid agencies been keeping up? Yes, I mean, some of that growth, some of that $17 billion is trying to keep up with these disasters. I think the exciting thing about natural disasters is that governments can usually retain control in those situations. It's not warring factions, so that there is still strong government. And that's where I would see the chance for new models of local and national humanitarian response, in other words, decolonized models of response, coming much more quickly from within the natural disaster situation. But then having said that, you can look at Haiti and see that it was kind of chaos at one level, as well as delivering a lot of good things. So it's not easy. And one of the problems with natural disasters is actually housing and things like that, because it's, agencies don't really know how to do emergency housing or housing quickly. And is it acceptable to have people waiting in bad housing for 2 years while you do very consultative sort of spatial, get security of tenure and these things? So housing is a huge issue in natural disaster stuff. In the war thing, I mean, armed conflict's actually going down. I mean, it's big in the Middle East at the moment, obviously. But compared to the time of the Sierra Leonean War and things in the 90s and early 2000s, there are many less wars now. Interestingly, if you were to look around the world and see where are most people being killed, where are most people meeting violent deaths, it won't be wars. I mean, Syria is a sort of exception and in the volume of people killed directly, violently in war. But most violent deaths are happening in violent societies in Central America and South America. So, the Mexican drug war hit 60,000 deaths and was way ahead of Syria until about, I think, 2 years into the Syrian crisis or something. And the homicide and femicide rate in Central America is really big and rising. So violent deaths, most of them are happening not in wars, but in these endemic homicidal, femicidal societies at the moment.
My second question is related with global, with the world system. Because a lot of, one perspective is saying why there's a local conflict or international conflict is due to increased inequality between the wealthy country and the poor country. So if we look at the humanitarian effort, even though the United States has been contributed a large amount of money, but that still cannot compensate the damage caused by the U.S. troops in probably in different regions over time. So what I try to point out is, can we think humanitarian as a remedy or the cure for the reducing this, try to reducing the conflict, international conflict, or even the local conflict, which can be fostered behind the international political level?
Okay. In terms of what humanitarianism can do, I don't think it can't sort of stop conflicts. It doesn't do that, and it can't sort of make peaceful societies. What people do think humanitarian aid has done is it has reduced the suffering in wars, bizarrely, because it looks as if it hasn't. But if I take the Armenian massacres and the Armenian, as many people would call it, genocide in 1917 in Turkey, the creation of modern Turkey, and I look at the Darfur ethnic cleansing in 2003, actually they're both quite similar situations. So the policy of the Turkish government at that time was to go into villages and shoot and rape and poison wells and get communities to move and go into really inhospitable areas where they would die, and they did. So you get 1 point something million people die from basically ethnic cleansing and clearance strategy. There was no international humanitarian system at that point. But in Darfur, very similar policies took place of rape and killing and poisoning wells and burning villages to make people clear an area. And similar numbers of people walked off, but they then were met by the international humanitarian community now, the international humanitarian system that I described, and 7 million people didn't die. Okay, so their lives were saved, but they were saved in this new configuration, etc. So I don't think humanitarian action solves war or creates peace in any way particularly, but it can reduce the suffering in war. And I think we can show that it has, probably, in some degrees. Your other question is about inequality and conflict. I'm not sure that, I think it's too easy to say that inequality drives all conflicts. I don't think it does. I think it's often an important ingredient. But if you look at analysis of the causes of conflict, inequality is usually only one factor, probably in about 10, 15 key indicators that usually happens. So I don't think we can just say it's just because one lot's rich and one lot's poor that they fight, because just as often they don't, when one lot's poor and one lot's rich. But inequality is usually in there somewhere. And the compensation issue, I mean, you're saying, well, if you fight a war, how can the damage ever be made good? And it's true, it often isn't. But some people are arguing that the next bit of international humanitarian law, the laws of war, should be about compensation, and a new convention should happen to say that after a war, warring parties must compensate civilian communities in line with damage done. I think that'll be very hard to do. But again, if I think from our own continent in Europe, I mean, twice now in the 20th century, the Americans have come and done massive recovery programs to try and rebuild, Europe after the wars. And that pattern of reconstruction aid does continue in most wars, but probably, as you say, not to the scale of the damage.
I think we'll have to stop there unless we have, we'll stop 2 quick pressing questions, so Alexander and then.
Yeah, so humanitarian intervention, or the oxymoronic term humanitarian bombing, very controversial ideas, and have been for the past 20 or so years in the realm of humanitarianism. In my opinion, I don't think we've seen a true humanitarian intervention with military that has been bereft of political bias and agenda. Do you think that this humanitarian bombing ideology really has a place in modern humanitarianism, or is something that collectively we can move past, or does it actually have a relevant place within the realm of humanitarianism?
Well, I think it is an oxymoron. I couldn't use that phrase. I wouldn't say humanitarian bombing. I wouldn't even really say humanitarian military intervention. I think they're different species of things. I think my understanding of humanitarian action is unarmed, non-violent, negotiated delivery of protection and humanitarian aid into civilian refugee or IDP communities. I think. So what you're talking about, I wouldn't call it humanitarian bombing, but I think it is legitimate, ethically, sometimes to use force to protect civilians. But I wouldn't say that was humanitarian action. I wouldn't say it was. I think that's, the current discourse and the new international doctrine that the UN's adopted is to talk about the responsibility to protect. And that responsibility can include the use of armed force in extremis. But I wouldn't call that a humanitarian intervention. That's an old IR term that people are trying to avoid now, I think. It was always used, as you say, particularly in the 19th century and the 20th century. But, we wouldn't want to talk about humanitarian bombing. We could understand the use of military force to protect civilian populations. But it wouldn't be a Red Cross plane that was doing the bombing. Get my point? Yeah.
And last question.
As an outsider perspective of non-refugees, what is your opinion on America's, to say the least, willful ignorance, and to say the most extreme support of Teodoro Mbasago. He's the current president of Equatorial Guinea, and his presence and his son's presence in the United States after his multiple indictments by both the African Union and the United Nations of multiple counts of corruption, human rights violations, etc.
It's a bit of an outlier question, isn't it? I've been to Equatorial Guinea, actually. It's quite difficult to get there. But anyway, I spent a week there. I don't know the details, but I think if someone's committed a crime and your country's law, which it often does very well, is able to arrest people outside the country for crimes committed in America or whatever, I think that should happen. I mean, I don't know what his son's done exactly and whatever, and that he's living in America. But the bigger problem about what you do with a dictator is a much more complicated political problem. And as we know, the usual tradition is to accommodate dictators and try and hope that you can minimize the risk they face to you and others by engaging with them. That probably doesn't answer your question, but I don't know the details of the son's activities.
His son recently, I believe it was 2012, bought one of the most expensive properties in Val using state funds from
Right. Right. Well, I don't know if that's a criminal offence under a US law, but I mean, it should be a criminal offence under his father's law, but it obviously isn't. Yeah.